Welcome to our September edition of GlobalView. FrontierView is part of FiscalNote, which is a leader in policy and global intelligence. By uniquely combining data, technology, and insights, FiscalNote empowers customers with critical insights and the tools to turn them into action. FrontierView is an integral part of FiscalNote's Global Intelligence Business Unit. We work as a trusted partner with over 300 multinationals, supporting senior executives such as VPs of region, CFOs, and strategy leads with practices around the world. Today, we are joined by Mark McNamee, who leads our Europe research practice, and is a very busy man because the war in Ukraine, of course, creates all kinds of complications to the story around Europe. And of course, in working with companies with footprint around the region, they're facing some very unique challenges. And Mark will help us understand a little bit about the latest in the war, especially given the counteroffensive, some questions around the future political environment for Ukraine, Russia's drama that we've seen over the past couple of months. There's a lot to discuss, and we'll try to make sense of all of it. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Martina.
So let's just start first with looking backward a little bit. We had a pretty unique situation with the mutiny by Evgeny Prigozhin back a couple of months ago, and of course he is no more following an airplane crash. But what does that tell us about Russia's approach to the war subsequent to that? Have there been any changes in the strategy or how Russia goes about prosecuting the war, and any changes in terms of domestic political stability in Russia?
Sure. So to start off with, related very directly to the war, not tangibly since then. And that's not really the underlying point, most likely, right? So it's just more related to political stability, which at the end of the day, this war is going to, as we've been telling clients, as you know, Martina, this war can really only end with the end of either Zelensky's administration in Kyiv or otherwise Putin's regime in Moscow. So more to the point, how Prigozhin's the mutiny through his assassination, how this impacts political stability in Moscow. And so looking at that just in brief, sort of fleshing it out, yes, Putin, of course, I suppose you could say, helped himself a bit, providing at least some temporary sort of reassertion of his authority and control, but this doesn't fundamentally actually rectify sort of the longer term damage to his authority and to his power, right? So it's hard to say that this is a real demonstration of strength, but instead this more exposes sort of the continued weakening of the Putin regime. At the end of the day, if Prigozhin were not a threat to Putin, and by the way, Prigozhin is Putin's creation from start to finish, Putin was unable to control his own creation and feared his continued existence and the potential threat to Putin's regime, and therefore needed to kill him instead. So actually, it's not a particularly good sign, of course, but it's also somewhat problematic for Putin going forward, because now he's going after a lot of those far-right hardline groups, which had, of course, historically supported him quite strongly the last 20 plus years. And so that means he is somewhat removing one of these core pillars of his political support, and somewhat isolating himself increasingly, having lost, obviously, a lot of support from other factions within Russia's elite, and now undermining the support of the very hardliners. That, again, the point being, in the future, what's the next crisis? And the support he would need from these very men going forward when he needs to manage whatever that next crisis will be. And so this is the underlying point. Directly answer your question, we're going to see much more rule by sort of fear, by arbitrary violence by the Putin regime, which makes policy governance much more unpredictable going forward. Then you add in, of course, the continued duration of the war, the pressures there, Ukraine making sort of gradual but continued gains, the impact of sanctions and what this is doing to the ruble and to inflation and to interest rates and domestic consumer and business demand and confidence and investment. All of these pressures, they're just going to continue to accrue and accrue and accrue. So it will be continue to be quite problematic going forward for Putin. We can't exactly say what the crisis will be, the extent of it, but there will be another one. And then how does this regime respond to that crisis at that time, now that things are a little bit more unstable in Moscow?
So, I mean, we talked to a lot of clients who are trying to figure out a way to integrate this into their plans, even in a very basic level for next year. Here, I think the audience have been looking at our latest scenarios with some updates in terms of likelihoods across how the war may play out. There's also, I guess, an accepted assumption that Russia is trying to drag this out for as long as possible and play for time until there's a US election that maybe changes the amount of US support for Ukraine. If you're a multinational, should you be expecting any sort of meaningful change in terms of Ukraine is at war with Russia for all of 2024? Or should companies basically assume a continuation of the current environment for all of next year based on what we know today?
Yes, I think assuredly companies should be planning for a continuation of the war. Maybe not quite as hot today. Say in 2 months from now, things do moderate a bit over the winter, but again, getting quite hot and future offensives by Ukraine spring of next year and deep into 2024. But we should expect continued fighting and the war to extend deep into next year. We do expect that the war will be tilting gradually into Ukraine's favor over the course of next year, but that does not mean that suddenly the fighting stops. Ukraine sort of wins in say, to throw out a month, July of next year, and then we look at a post-war situation. So at that point, we just believe that the negotiating terms would start to favor Ukraine, say in the second half of next year after some more successful counteroffensives. But longer term, executives should be expecting Ukraine and Russia to be fighting deep into next year, and if not into 2025.
Got it. Okay. And I guess even beyond that, there's still open questions about whether or not Ukraine will have to cede territory. What does that look like? I guess there's a lot still to play out, and it's hard to know exactly the shape that any sort of negotiated situation might take.
Right. And there's, I mean, sitting where we're at today, we're quite far away from a resolution, a ceasefire, much less peace terms. But one thing to bear in mind, and this, as you know, Martina, you and I have discussed this, some of the things I took away from my visits to Kyiv this past summer, speaking with executives, speaking with different investment analysts and military analysts on the ground there. Longer term, where is Ukraine? So one, you can likely bet that the Zelensky administration is going to have a very difficult time trying to end this war in some amicable way that pleases the majority of the population, right? So what does that look like, as we say, maybe in a year from now or towards the end of next year and into 2025? So you can see some political difficulties rising, and a lot of this has to do with what would the population, what would the military be satisfied with? How much Western pressure would there be on Kyiv to accept some sort of maybe ceasefire terms? So a lot of this, though, relates to, do they want really get back all the way to 1991 borders, Ukrainian population and the military and the government, or would they maybe over time be satisfied with maybe trading land for peace? According to surveys, there's absolutely there's no reason to believe that they would trade land for peace, but maybe it's more over time the Ukrainian population and military and government would be willing to accept maybe some deal if they got security guarantees, ideally NATO, of course. So, but realistically, looking at things as you can see here, maybe some resolutions as we saw during the Cold War related to Korea, related to Berlin, some of these types of things which might become more realistic. Just it relates to investors, just a last word on this, related to maybe you return back to sort of the conflict that the war, the nature of the war that it undertook from 2014 to February 2022, which is continued fighting at a lower level, and you get Russia to basically agree to not be lobbing missiles and drones consistently across Western and Central Ukraine. So allowing some of that money to come back in and investors start to look to the country again.
So speaking of investment, and just very briefly, Mark, how do we think about the potential for reconstruction activity in Ukraine? There's, of course, a lot that still needs to happen, but what are the main parameters about potentially returning to Ukraine for any companies that have scaled back their presence there?
Right. So, and again, from being on the ground there and speaking with a lot of companies, this sort of graphic here describes and in order of what's sort of on their mind, what they're looking for, and what headquarters is waiting for in order to drive that investment back. So first and foremost, you need more clarity on the war, not necessarily a clear resolution, but more clarity on the war, and ideally security, and if not security, investment guarantees provided by the West, but getting security guarantees ideally for Ukraine, which would allow then investors to start looking much more strongly at the country. In addition, for the most robust reconstruction, as noted here, it realistically, they'll have to take over $300 billion of Russia's frozen FX reserves, frozen the weekend of the invasion last year. That would serve as sort of the foundation, which then would encourage public institutions, IMF, World Bank, et cetera, but then also EU, United States, other Western-oriented governments. And then on top of that, private investors seeing that foundation, then willing to sort of top it off with their own investment. And again, more specifically with companies, they need to see removal of capital controls, return of refugees. Ukraine, the population within Ukrainian borders currently, probably around 30 million, roughly. That's down from roughly 40 million prior to the war. So you just simply need a return of those consumers, of those laborers, to keep the economic engine running. And part of that relates to, of course, the fact that Ukraine has had a poor track record related to rule of law, needless to say. And so considerable improvements there. And frankly, from being on the ground there, from hearing this from government officials, from hearing it from economists, from executives themselves, there has been progress over the last several years. And there is this deeper held belief that as a result of the trauma of the war, the country is going through sort of a economic and political cultural transformation. Where the old ways won't be acceptable anymore. And it's a matter of sort of Ukrainian national identity going forward, that they don't want to behave the way businesses and the government behaved over the last 30 years and become more of a Western-oriented country. And so, of course, improvement of rule of law and reduction in graft and corruption will be a core part of that.
Got it. Thank you, Mark. I think we can probably have this conversation for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. Really good insights, and I'm glad that we're finishing on a maybe more positive note as well. Thank you for everybody who listened to our edition of GlobalView today. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today. And goodbye. See you next time.
Take care. Thanks.